back to Dazatron's Diorama Llama, and this is the second part of my video on how to make a jagged rock diorama. So it's quite a small piece, as you can see, and do check out my other video on just using just the offcuts of styrofoam from other bases that you may have made. Keep those little bits because they come in handy for making lots of these kind of rocks, as you can see here. So I've already given it a base coat just with black acrylic, and I'm going to show you now how to paint that up using the dry brush technique. So my desk spot today is Sky Shadow from the Titans Return series, so I think it looks great. So he's going to be keeping a watch over this video. So let me just turn the camera a little bit so you can see a little bit better. Equipment you need for this: you need a surface to put your paints on. A plastic plate is great for that. You need some rag or kitchen towel. You need some old brushes, and again, if you've seen my other painting videos, the older the better when it comes to using the dry brush technique. And you need some acrylic paints, and a little bit of water in a pot as well is useful. Just wanted to just show you, I suppose, the difference between some of the paints you can get. So if you are into kind of painting models, particularly kind of miniatures that you might get for board games, or if you are into Games Workshop, which is now called Warhammer, you might be used to some of these kind of sets. So this is Vallejo. I think it's a Spanish company actually. Been going for a long time. Really good reputation. I purchased these probably 2 or 3 years ago for a board game I just purchased, and I wanted to paint up the models. So these came highly recommended, and not too expensive, but I suppose a bit pricier than what you would pay for normal acrylics. But yeah, really nice set. So if you was getting into this area and you wanted to do a bit more painting, I'd highly recommend Vallejo paints because they're really good. And the nice thing about these paints is it's a different consistency to regular acrylic. So these are much thinner, so it creates a much thinner layer of paint when you're painting models or miniatures. So you're not going to get lumps of paint, so you can still see that kind of fine detail in the miniatures, whereas if you use regular acrylic, particularly on fine details, you will find that kind of covers up the detail, it flattens it out, so you don't want that. So you do want model paints essentially. You can use Games Workshop's paints or Warhammer paints, they would work just as well, and I'm sure there are other brands as well that you can use. You can also just water down or thin down regular acrylic. Certainly for these dioramas, that would work absolutely fine. But again, if you're using miniatures and you've paid a lot of money for a miniature, and they do cost quite a lot of money, I would suggest getting some proper paints for that. As I've said in my previous videos though, whatever acrylic paints you can get hold of. This is quite a good make, Dale Rowney, but it's their cheaper end called the Graduate range. But you can pick up just kind of own brand, I suppose, acrylics, really cheap, and they will work absolutely fine for what we're going to do today. So I'm just going to take a bit of black and a bit of white and just put it onto my base here. Very small amount of black is needed because black goes a long way, and a little bit more white. So I'm just using the regular acrylics for this, just to show you the difference. But you can see on there that's quite thick, as it comes out in its consistency. Whereas if I take some of the Vallejo paint, just take a bit of the white here, and you can even hear that, and just squeeze a bit of that out next to this white. Can you just see how that kind of runs down the palette? Yeah, so it's really thin. So again, great for fine details. But we want to use the dry brush technique, so regular acrylics will work fine. So I'm just going to take a bit of that white, tiny bit of the black to make a grey. I'm just going to load up the brush, so I'm just kind of putting on or brushing the brush backwards and forwards, just so that there's plenty of paint on there and it's inside all the bristles. And then I want to actually wipe that off, so I want to take a lot of that paint off onto a bit of kitchen towel or rag, and then you're just going to brush this backwards and forwards over the surface, so it kind of catches the parts that are sticking out where there's a texture, and any area that's indented is going to remain black. So that's the idea, and I'm going to kind of create these kind of shadows. So I'm just going to brush over the top. See if I can bring that right close to the camera. Now you can do it really quickly as well. I mean, that works just as fine. Sometimes it actually works better if you do this quite quickly. So you will find that really small amount of paint that I had on my brush, and I've wiped most of it off, actually goes a long way. And even though acrylic paint dries quickly, for this technique, you don't have to keep loading up the brush or wetting the brush. It does seem to transfer the paint quite easily. So you can see I'm using the brush quite vigorously over the surface, and then that will just kind of grab those edges even better. So I've only done that one rock so far, but hopefully, I don't know if the camera captures this, but you can see it's just pulling out some of those details. So hopefully you can see that, as compared to these pieces here that have just been primed with the black. So I'm going to do that to the whole thing, and I'll come back to you in a moment. Right, so once I've given this one coat all over, you can see it's just picking out some of these details. I could go light on this, but I want this to kind of look like kind of granite. So I don't want to go too light, but it really is, it's personal preference, so it's up to you. You can also add a bit of brown in there if you wanted to. So yeah, play with your colour schemes, it's completely up to you. But as I said, I want to keep this quite dark and kind of foreboding is the idea. But just what I was going to say is I tend to still mix up a lighter tone. So whatever shade I'm going for, even if it's a lighter grey, to finish I tend to mix up an even lighter version than what I've used elsewhere. And I don't wipe this off on the surface. I'm not using a dry brush here, but I'm also not putting a big blob of paint on. So I'm kind of drying it off on the palette, and I use that just to kind of catch the very edges. So I'm just going to see if it'll pick up on here. There we go. So I'm just touching the very edges of the rocks, just to really pick out those kind of highlights, or those surfaces that I want to kind of stand out a little bit more. I don't know if you can see that well on here. So I'm just touching the very edge. I'm not doing this all over. And I just find that kind of acts as a highlight. Yeah, I think you can just see it on the bottom ones down here though. Those edges just kind of stick out a little bit more. So I think that's just a good way to kind of finish your piece once you're happy with the general colour and dry brushing technique on the rest of it. So I've added the dry brush technique all over onto each surface, including the side of the base as well. And I've also taken a fine brush, and it is worthwhile picking up something like this. Again, it doesn't have to be expensive. Use that to just kind of thin down some black acrylic, just using a bit of water, mix it with the acrylic so you get a thinner consistency. Or if you have got access to the miniature paints that I showed you earlier, that would work just as well. And what this is great for is getting into all of those kind of nooks and crannies and the crevices, and just kind of adding a bit of black in there to darken up those areas and make it look like it's in shadow. It's also good for covering up any mishaps with the glue. And if you remember in my making of video, that happened to me, where some of the glue was kind of starting to foam out from underneath these rock formations and didn't look very nice at all. So I've removed most of it, but there's still some little bits that I couldn't quite remove. So just using a little bit of black acrylic just to touch up those areas, it just kind of finishes the job. And that's the key with this really. If you do make any mistakes with the dry brush technique, you could just paint over it and do it again. Paint over it black to black or whatever base colour you used, let it dry, and then start again. So you really cannot go wrong with this technique, but hopefully you can see just what a difference it makes. It really pulls out all that texture that we added with the foil ball, say that right. So yeah, if you remember, we crushed up a bit of foil and we pressed that into the styrofoam and kind of scratched up the surface, and that really does kind of give it more of a natural, realistic look. So yeah, please have a go. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. You'll be rewarded for your efforts, because I think these look great. And as I said, it's just using bits of offcuts from the other bases that you may have had a go at. So you can't go wrong. All of it's being used in some way. None of it's going to waste. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.